great to see so many of you with us this morning. We have a very full programme. My colleague, Dr. Stephanie Denning, will say a word or two about that in just a moment, but you can see that we've got sessions running through today and tomorrow, and I'd like to thank my colleagues, Dr. Stephanie Denning from the Centre for Trust, Peace and Social Relations, Professor Peter Scott from the University of Manchester, and Professor Robert Beckford from the University of Winchester, and the Queen's Foundation for Ecumenical Theological Education. We've worked together, the four of us, over the last 3 years on our Life on the Breadline project, which is a groundbreaking project, the first theological project by academic theologians of its kind to explore and analyse Christian responses to poverty in the UK since the age of austerity began following the 2008 financial crash. We've explored, as you will hear over the next couple of days, the scope, the nature and the impact of Christian action on poverty. I'm also delighted to be able to welcome two really fantastic guest speakers. Dr. Naomi Maynard from Together Liverpool and Feeding Liverpool will be talking to us later on this afternoon. And tomorrow morning, Professor Anthony Reddy of the University of Oxford will be our guest speaker. I'm going to hand over to Stephanie in just a moment. Stephanie, over to you.
Thanks, Chris. Welcome everybody, and thank you for joining us. A couple of housekeeping things. We have a conference scribe, Katie Chappell, with us. Katie is going to be doing some drawings to illustrate the sessions as they go along. So thank you for joining us, Katie. And we'll see there's different ways that we'll be sharing Katie's images throughout the conference, so that will become apparent as we go along. Thank you very much to Gwyneth Cross and Imogen Bayliss for their Zoom assistance today. Last couple of housekeeping things. If you're on Twitter or on other forms of social media and would like to share about the conference, then that would be great. And our hashtag is #BreadlineResearch, all one word. Without further ado, we will go on to the remainder of this session, which starts with really framing what this research has been about in two ways. First, austerity, and then in a moment, I'll come on to poverty. So austerity in the UK has been going on well over a decade now. And during the Life on the Breadline research, we have been talking about three different meanings of austerity that I'm just going to go over briefly now. The first is economic austerity, and that's maybe the way that most people, if they think about austerity, how most people think about austerity. So economic austerity is reduction in government public spending in order to reduce government debt. So that started, as I said, over a decade ago now, in response to the 2008 financial crash. And the reductions in public spending have primarily been seen in things like changes to the welfare state, reduction in spending in schools, in the NHS and other public services. And at the time and still now, the government and other politicians have often presented austerity in that way as necessary and that there was no other option. But other countries such as Iceland do show that there were other alternatives to respond to the financial crash. Secondly, personal austerity. So austerity is an economic policy, but it also affects people's daily lives. And so this is a second important way of understanding austerity. It's not just a sort of dry policy that gets talked about in government, but actually it makes a difference to how you live, how I live, and how each person in the UK lives. And that's something that the geographer Sarah Marie Hall has emphasised, that we have followed in this research to look at the everyday impacts of austerity in people's daily lives. Thirdly, austerity can be associated with self-restraint. And here we remember that the current period of austerity is not the only period of austerity that the UK and other countries have experienced. So during the Second World War and following the Second World War, there was a period of austerity in the UK. And here we can see quite a romanticized nature of austerity, as people remember back to people coming together, pulling together, tightening your belt, making do, and that kind of idea. And that can mean that we look back at austerity as remembering, oh, that was a time that everyone managed together, and it can become almost romanticized. So those are three different meanings of austerity that each overlap. But it's also important to say that austerity is often not used in people's everyday language. And that's been something that we've engaged with in this research. So we've asked our different research participants what they think of the meaning of the word austerity. So we've had some responses, such as from Bishop Paul Butler in the Church of England, who in an interview said, austerity means that life's become tougher and harder for many people. An interview with a B30 food bank volunteer, she said, when I said, have you personally been affected by austerity? She said, me personally, no, I'm very lucky. Middle class, middle-aged, the right demographic. And so here we see the unequal impact of austerity. Whilst austerity has affected each of us in different ways, it's not affected us equally. So the people that have been most affected by austerity are the poorest in society, women more than men, single parents more than other family units, disabled people more than people who aren't disabled, people of ethnic and racial minorities, and children and young people have been affected more than pensioners. That's just some of the groups in society who have been most affected. And for some people, austerity just isn't a word that's used. So Jim, one of our research participants, when I said, what if anything, does the word austerity mean to you? He said, I think it sounds like a posh word that the government use, which maybe goes back to that economic definition of austerity. The Life on the Breadline website, which you can get to by Googling Breadline research, has an austerity timeline on it. And on that, we highlight some of the key policies and effects of austerity in the last decade. So key things in particular are freezes in the rates of benefits, and also the introduction of universal credit. And I'll talk about some of the impact of that tomorrow in the session on food banks. Moving now to the next slide. The second important concept in our research has been poverty itself. And we've defined poverty fairly broadly to mean when people do not have enough resources to meet their basic needs and to take part in society. So poverty is about a lack of participation, and it's about not having enough for your basic needs. And that can be different in one country to another. So for some people, poverty is something that exists in other countries, but actually millions of people are living in poverty in the UK today. We asked our research participants whether they thought poverty had changed over the last decade. And the majority of research participants thought that poverty had worsened over the last decade. People recognized that that wasn't necessarily an increase in the number of people experiencing poverty, although that is often the case in different areas, but also a worsening in terms of people's experiences of poverty. So on this slide, we've got some of the ways that people talked about how they saw poverty in their local neighbourhoods and across the UK. People often talked about food banks, talked about rises in homelessness, rises in the number of people rough sleeping. In general, people just not having enough money to live on, whether that's from benefits or whether that's in work poverty. People talked about long-term deprivation, and here it's important to recognise that poverty in the UK is not a new problem. Whilst it has worsened over the last decade, and poverty has been directly related to austerity, it's not a new thing. People also talked about unemployment rising, talked about the issue of low pay and insecure jobs. So poverty is not something that's just associated with being on benefits, but actually in-work poverty is rising. People talked about poverty linked to poor health, and people talked about poverty linked to people living in poor quality housing. When we ask people about the causes of poverty, often the way that people saw poverty and the causes of poverty would be overlapped. And it's important to emphasize here that we are talking about both the welfare state, but also talking about in-work poverty as well. Our research participants were national church leaders, regional church leaders across the UK, and also 6 case studies. And with that, I'm going to hand back to Chris to talk about some of our headline findings.
Thanks very much indeed, Stephanie. Just in brief, I wanted to share with you some of the headlines from our research over the last 3 years. The first thing that we want to argue, and we have shown, is that there is a need for a bold, liberative, multidisciplinary and intersectional theology of poverty that engages with the multidimensional nature of poverty. There are many different engagements that social scientists and theologians and practitioners and churches and church leaders have made with poverty. But what we're wanting to argue is that to date, within academic theology, there has not yet been a bold enough, liberative enough, multidisciplinary enough, and intersectional enough theology of poverty to address the intersectional nature of austerity age, poverty and inequality. The second thing we want to suggest is that, and the second thing that we have discovered, is that whilst many of us may think of Christian responses to poverty in caring or campaigning frameworks, the picture is far more messy, far more complicated than that. There are a variety of different approaches that churches and Christian NGOs and individual Christians have made to poverty during the age of austerity. We've encountered 6 different models that you will see there on the screen: caring, social enterprise, advocacy, prosperity, campaigning, and self-help. And whilst those are in separate little circles, you'll see the circles are dotted and they're connected, because what we're wanting to show is that none of those separate traditions or approaches to engaging with poverty is separate or hermetically sealed. The third research finding we want to just headline is that appealing to the common good lies at the heart of most institutional church responses to poverty, less so in certain NGO sectors within the Christian community, but certainly within the institutional church, the focus has been on the common good. 4 more points to mention briefly. Whilst theological appeals to the common good often include verbal commitments to what's often referred to as God's preferential option for the poor, this needs to stimulate the active transformation of unjust structures. For a number of decades, many Christian denominations in the UK have been partners, have signed up to the marks of mission, one of which is the commitment to work to transform unjust structures. There is a verbal commitment on the part of the overwhelming majority of churches that we engaged with and Christian traditions that we engaged with in Life on the Breadline. What we're wanting to suggest is that sometimes that commitment can stop short of actively embodying God's preferential option for the poor and working in a proactive way to transform unjust structures. The next point to make is that in light of transforming unjust structures, what we have seen in our research and what we want to suggest is that churches continue to grapple and perhaps need to wrestle more with the tension between their own social action and commitment to feeding the hungry and clothing the naked and welcoming the stranger on the one hand, and the state's withdrawal during this neoliberal age of austerity on the other hand. Is there a tension between feeding somebody who is hungry but not challenging those government ministers whose policies many churches believe lead people to food banks in the first place? There's a challenge there that we want to lay before the churches. Second, the next point to make is that many churches, as we've discovered during Life on the Breadline, remain at a distance. They're not disengaged from people who are experiencing poverty, but they do remain at a distance from people's everyday experiences of the rawness of the reality of poverty. And what we've discovered is that this limits the effectiveness of Christian engagement with poverty. And the final headline finding to mention just for now is time and time again over the last 3 years, we have encountered ways in which the church uses its cultural capital to challenge cultural and media and political depictions and narratives and discourses around poverty. The church has an immense influence on the ways in which millions of people in the UK think about and frame their lives. What we want to suggest within the Life on the Breadline team is that the church needs to use this cultural capital to ensure that poverty is seen as morally unacceptable in the 21st century in the 6th richest nation on earth. Gustavo Gutierrez challenges us, suggesting that the role of the theologian is not a neutral one. The theologian, says Gutierrez, is called to be an organic intellectual, engaged where nations, social classes, and people struggle to free themselves from oppression. And as Dietrich Bonhoeffer, murdered by the Nazis just weeks before the end of the Second World War, said, the church is called not simply to bind up the wounds of the broken beneath the wheels of injustice, but to ram a spoke into the wheel of injustice itself. This is our calling as academics, as researchers, as social scientists, as theologians, as the church. We're going to move in a moment to a session where my colleague Peter Scott is going to talk to us about the theology of poverty and the poverty of theology. But before we do that, we would like to share just briefly some of the images that Katie has been drawing during this opening session, and to welcome you once again to what I hope will be a challenging 2 days as we explore together Christian responses to poverty during this age of austerity.